Oh, okay, Mark. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to have to share the screen and then you're going to have to.
Oh, no, you're going to mess everything up.
No, we're not going to do that. It'll all work very nicely. Let's do it again. It'll just save your voice a few words.
I have a long lecture today, yes.
Here we go.
Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANs processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
All right, Alex, you're going to have to reshare the screen with us. There we go. We see your screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I want to welcome everyone to the North American Corona team meeting. That obviously includes Canada, the US, and of course, Mexico. There's an extremely large Spanish contingent that follows this program in the background. I want to welcome them as well. And of course, this has turned into an international meeting. There are a lot of people who are attending this meeting, and it's late in the evening, and I thank you all for being here. We are actually talking about the plasma science as put forward by Marin Tavakovic. This is a new science, only insofar as its recognition, because we now have context and we have a different kind of understanding, and this is brought by Mr. Kesh through the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute. And so this is a continuation of the basic understanding. Today's subject is the Krebs cycle. This is April the 18th. My name is Alexander, and this is part of the Kesh Foundation Canada Plasma Education Series. We have tried to proceed and try and keep up with Mr. Kesh, and that is an impossibility. He moves at such a rapid clip. However, we do want to bring in the context and use this as a bridge and see how that works together. When we're dealing with the subject, we have to have the terminology to discuss this, and the words are important. We have to be able to use words in their proper context and understand, and I'm so pleased to see, especially in the Brazilian and Italian community, the Universal Council members, on a lot of fronts, we're seeing the use of the terminology, and it makes communication so much easier. We have other terminology which is even more difficult to understand because it's a little bit more advanced for a lot of people. They're not interested in this because they just want to understand about the cups of life and to get rid of some of the maladies within their life. But we have to understand these other things because they're going to change our life. Our life has already changed. And so we're having to look at different ways of energy transition. And is this transfer of energy, transition, transmission? Are we doing the main conversion of energy, or are we converging residues? What are we doing exactly? So we try to discuss in basic terms the X, Y, and Z axis, which involves the rotation, the polarity, and the field strength. And the rotation is the transmission of energy. The polarity is the transition of energy through the various fields. And of course, the field strength is the transmutation of energy. It starts at the core, the plasma, and the plasma has a position, but that position is constantly moving because there's an interaction with other plasmas. And this interaction is a dynamic plasma. It all boils down to energy in motion. And we discussed energy in motion as having a charge. And that charge gives us the direction how we go through the various geometries, which we're going to discuss in more detail today, and going through the various dimensions of the soul dimensions, which was so eloquently put forward by Marie in this introduction. And of course, to understand all of this, we will be elaborating on the emotions, which involve creation, co-creation, and procreation. This is an ongoing discussion, and will show us how we can go through the various ranges and how we can transcend these ranges, because this is exactly what we have to do. When we go through the discussions of the universal order of creation of matters, we see that energy is always flowing, and we don't know how to capture this energy. And the main reason for it is because, like music, you can't grab onto it. Like emotions, you can't hold it. You can only experience it, or you can see the effect. And to understand the creation of the universe, we have to understand that the universe exists from energy. And this energy is a charge in motion, and that it is always in motion. This is a very important point. So we cannot stop the energy. We can stop the manifestation in a particular dimension, but we cannot stop the flow of energy. So the manifestation in a particular dimension is how we define matter. Matter is the manifestation of energy, but there is what we call in the old science, the small m matter, which is very physical. There's in the new science is a capital M matter, which is very plasmatic. In both cases, there's a manifestation of this energy. And so we've found that we can bind this energy together, or we can create this energy. And the manifestation is binding and it is creating. And so we say that energy binding is creation. Another aspect, of course, is that we've broken through and understanding what is the difference between the physical state, which we can touch, and the plasmatic state, which we cannot touch. And that has to do with light and our understanding of light and how it conveys matter and how it becomes matter. So our physical state, or our existence as we understand it, is really a manifestation of light matter. But there are other factors, because you see, when we talk about the principal matter, the PMTECs are flowing through the universe and they interact, but they interact in various ways to create fields. And when these fields interact, they create a MAGRAV condition. This MAGRAV condition is the balance, but it is a containment of energy. And then from there, it has to do something with it. And the question then becomes, as knowledge seekers, and as we work diligently to seek this knowledge, so what? What is going to change? And for some of us, it's going to change a lot of things. And for some of us, it's not going to change anything. So our point of view with respect to this whole aspect is critical. We are not only part of the energy in motion, we are part of the manifestation of the physicality. In other words, context. We are part of the context, and that context is our environment. So therefore, we are part of the environment. This is where the difference comes between the participant and the observer. we are both. Our point of view, of course, is to understand that we are not just on this planet, but we are within our own spaceship. And our own spaceship is a constitution of the components of the soul, the emotional context, and the physicality. And so that falls within the range of this planet, which also has a soul, also has an emotion and a physicality. And there's a reason for us to be here. And that has to do with the compatibility between our emotion and this Earth's emotion. And at this point in time, we can clearly say that the Earth has been crying for help. And sometimes you have to ask yourself, who do you ask help for or from? Who do you ask help from? And so hopefully the person you're asking help from is a person who can provide the help and actually has the care and compassion to do so. These are skills that we have to learn, because the way business is conducted on this planet, we find that we're not really understanding how energy is working. So one of the fundamental things is the PM ticks, which we call energy in motion. These are parceling units, which we call energy packs. We find that viruses are constructed this way, and there is a force field interaction. This force field consists of components, which we called antimatter, being principal matter, dark matter, which is either transition or transmission matter. And then, of course, there's plasmatic matter, which is the manifestation of light matter. All of these things come into a balance, which we call a maggraph. None of these things that I've discussed here are physical. These are all in plasmatic state. And so this is what makes it difficult for us to understand if we're from the show me state. There is, however, an artifact, and that is the neutron component. That is at the core. It is a gravitational component. And although we can't see it, we can see the result of it. And from there, things begin to happen. One of the things that we can see, however, is water on this planet. And so we're using water as an example to demonstrate the workings of an energy parceling unit. This particular parceling unit consists of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, which we call a water molecule. And we look on the left-hand side, we said that the hydrogen is negative and the oxygen is positive. But there's a maggrav conditioning that creates a balance here. And it may be hard to believe that the 2 hydrogens and the 1 oxygen can create a balanced position. And there is. But the water is a universal solvent. And thank God for that, because that life wouldn't be possible on this planet. Life wouldn't be possible, actually, in the whole universe if we didn't have a possibility to do energy in motion. This energy in motion is through electron shearing, where we actually take the negative hydrogen and we break it off or cut it off, shear it off, and it goes somewhere. Where it goes, I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that what's left behind is the hydroxyl, which is still a maggrav. It is a 1 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. The collective maggrav condition here is of a negative charge. And where does that go? Well, this is the point. This is the universal solvent. So to maintain its magnetical gravitational relationship of a maggrav, the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. But then from there, it needs to go somewhere. And before it goes somewhere, it has to maintain its condition. And so how does it do that? When we say the higher strength feeds the weaker strength, the weaker somehow has to feed the higher strength in order for it to maintain its maggrav condition. And can it do that on the same dimension or the same plane or the same axis? Well, obviously not, because we have to look at the various dimensions. We're living in a multidimensional universe. It is from this position that we can interact with other things. So when we look at this particular construction, which is in the physicality, and then we look at what we lost was the hydrogen component, and we find an extreme similarity between the hydrogen component and the hydroxyl water molecule. And that is that there's two parts in it. One's an electron, one's a proton. There's a extremely high difference in mass. The proton is 1,849 times larger than the electron. So that is 1.8 orders of magnitude. And it is both in a balanced position. But what is notable is that it's missing a neutron. But we do have a magnetical gravitational relationship. So there's an orientation and it wants to go somewhere. But before it goes somewhere, it has to maintain its mag-grav condition. If the proton is feeding the electron, how does the electron feed the energy back to the proton? And this is another good question. So we keep asking questions, we got to come up with some answers. So we understand that there's an interaction point in the infinity loop, and this interaction point is kind of the same interaction point that might exist between the sun and the earth. And of course, that is the reality. And so this is the gravitational point that is drawing energy in. And when we draw energy in, then the energy can flow. And so therefore the energy has to flow out. This is true of the hydrogen. This is true of the water molecule. This is true of man. This is true of our souls. This is true of the sun. This is true of the earth. This is true of the universal flow of energies. And this is the thing, knowledge seekers find the truth. And so we're back to the core component. One moment, please. I'm going at a fairly rapid clip because we're repeating a lot and repetition is good. In my own experience, by the time I got things through to my thick skull, it only took me 15 repetitions. So if you can do this in less than 15 repetitions, you're doing better than me. But this is the thing. I have a force and knowledge is a force. And when these two forces come together, they create a condition. Sometimes energy comes in and goes around, or sometimes it goes right through. So when it comes in and goes around and we retain that energy, then we create the beginnings of a mag-grav. And that mag-grav is a balance between the X and Y axis. And then of course it creates a rotating field. And now we have our third dimension. From there, energy has to come and energy has to go. Take a moment to look at this diagram. You're right, Mark. Thanks for preserving my voice.
I was going to say, this diagram looks a little bit like the ribs of the lungs in a way.
Isn't that fascinating? Also, what you'll notice is that there's a twist. So in other words, that the energy is coming in from the outside, going in, and then on the inside, it has to twist around to go back out. So there are actually two rotations. And there are two rotations on each side. And this is the key to understanding the plasma science. Energy is a two-way street. And it goes both ways in all ways. In other words, when you create something, you also create something else. This is kind of different from the way we do our manufacturing. We bring products in, we reprocess them, and we create a product. But we also create garbage. The product we create is valuable. The garbage we create is disposable. That's not how the universe works. the universe is much more efficient. And this is where we have to understand about the plasma science. When we understand that the energy is coming and constantly coming, and the way to maintain this energy is through a rotating field. As a complex being, can you understand that we are actually energy fields of various energy strengths? So if we have various energy strengths, then we have multiple energy fields, and each one of these fields is operating within a field strength. In order to operate within that field strength, it has to be different and distinct from another field strength. So in other words, we are capable of working through various dimensions within a range. And not only are we working within the range within which we can see physically, but there is a range that is not limited by the boundary of our physicality, but actually goes beyond the boundary. One of the questions that should be asked is, what happens, where is this new boundary? If it goes beyond the boundary, how far beyond the boundary does it go? And so you could also ask is, how big is large? And this is a tough question to understand, because you have to take context into consideration here. And so when we created a star formation, we created a context. In other words, we created 4 rotating fields that came together. And these 4 rotating fields, these are physical balls that are full of gas, and they were rotating with electric motor, and they created a plasma field, but collectively, they created a dynamic plasma. And so what we had was a realization that we had small matter state, which is the physical rotating balls, the GAN state, which is a plasmatic condition, but still in physicality. We had a plasma state with a rotating field, and we had a dynamic plasma state with the integration of the 4 dynamic fields, and it created a dynamic plasma state. And there was an orientation of a magnetical gravitational orientation, but it was balanced. And the balance point, the core, is a dynamic plasma state. And the question is, how far does it go out? I know I keep asking a lot of questions, but there's another question that has come up, and that is, we see that within this range, we have 4 dimensions: matter, GANs, plasma, dynamic plasma. The plasma and dynamic plasma are non-tangible, non-visible. The matter state and GAN state are tangible and visible. But there is a fence, if you will. And this is going from a non-physical to a physical field. How do we jump over that fence? And where is that fence exactly? That question was discussed on Thursday at the $376 Seekers Workshop. And I must say, that was a dramatic session. If you haven't heard it, please review it. And you may have to review it about 15 times. But if you take it 16 times, you owe me 25 cents. The thing is that we have physical and a plasmatic condition, a reality, which we call plasma reality, and a physical reality. Now we understand that the physical reality depends on the plasma reality. So there's an interaction, and there's a fence to jump over. How do we go from one side to the other? Well, we discussed dimension building, right? We took a point, we added a second point and connected it once. We took a third, connected to fourth, to 3, a fifth to 4, and added a 6th one to connect to 5. And we found that there was a similarity in terms of progression from the basic Earth to the dynamic plasma condition. And we also discovered that we've got things upside down. And we can say that because the Earth is on the bottom, because we're walking on the Earth. And the Earth's range, the Earth's gravitational point is the ground. And the magnetical point is the magnetosphere. And we're operating within that range. But as we saw with the star formation reactor a few slides ago, we could go through various dimensions. And again, we see that we have physical dimension and a plasmatic dimension. And again, there's some kind of fence in between. And how do we jump over that fence? And there's that discussion again. So there was a discussion with respect to the periodic table of elements. And this periodic table reflects all of the physical elements that are on this planet. And so we look at limitations on this planet. Some of the limitations, of course, were the speed of light. We've broken through that. Some of the limitations are in our visible range. Obviously, we know that we can go beyond the visible range. Some of the limitations are in our auditory range, but we know that there are harmonics beyond our auditory range. Well, there are elements also that are beyond the periodic table of elements. And we're talking about the periodic table of elements that are physical in the range on this planet. And so what we're looking forward to down the road is a plasmatic table of elements. And we have to take that into consideration because we've been playing with, we're just going to take a close-up look of some of the basic components. We've been using the copper and the zinc to make our ganses. One cup, second cup, cup of man, cup of soul, and all these other good things. We've been looking at our amino acids, which are carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. And of course, the universal solvent, which is the oxygen-hydrogen relationship. And the only difference between all of these elements and hydrogen is the number of neutrons, of which hydrogen doesn't have a neutron in the physical state. But there are other states. There is another aspect that I'd like to look at. We discussed that carbon-based is organic, silicon-based is inorganic. The Earth is silicon-based. And then we find a new relationship was drawn into the equation on Thursday, the relationships between phosphorus, sulfur, and chlorine. And we find that that is kind of offset to the right. We're not going to discuss these today in the kind of detail that we could. What we are going to discuss is the phosphorus and its impact on life. Because you see, when we look at star formations and what we originally looked at various examples of star formations, we find many, many artifacts. And what are artifacts? Artifacts are the result of energy in motion and the combination of these energies in motion. So interestingly enough, when we closely examine the organs of the body, we find that they're in a star formation. They relate to other endocrine organs in our body. They're also the star formation. We know about the production of methane, the Earth's crust, ammonium, of course, hemoglobin. And this is one of the things that is very important for us because it has an iron component. Chlorophyll is important for the vertical people. Magnesium is a key component there. Phosphate is an important component. We're going to discuss that today. These are all MAGRAV reactors. And these are all face-centered tetrahedrons as well, because they are creating a plasmatic condition, you see. So we discussed what these things are when we looked at the balance of relationships. The relationships between the magnetical gravitational field forces are a MAGRAV condition. This is the basic basic relationship. And we find that we have imposed some limitations scientifically and some limitations spiritually. We are going to add these two together and create a new balanced condition and move forward, because you see, our bodies are made up of a lot of cells, and our cells, what we're seeing, are a manifestation, and we know that manifestation is of matter. And today we're going to discuss that even more. What we do know is that the soul acts as a conversion agent of the life coming into this planet. And from there, it manifests itself into cells. And so I'd like to discuss that in greater detail. We look at the basic construct of an amino acid chain, or any chain. And so 3 is kind of the basic component. 3 is kind of the magic number. They call it the Holy Trinity, and they don't call it the Holy Trinity for nothing. And we have many, many references in the scientific and spiritual community with respect to the number 3. But when we find the two together, then we create an orientation, and we understand the outsides are negative and the center is positive. And the reason for that is because the only way to make an attraction that holds this chain together is to have a pole flipping orientation. In other words, the center magnet in this picture has to be flipped with relationship to the others. Because if we were to flip this one, then there would be a repulsion. Well, so what we're talking about today is attraction. And so when we look at the manifestation of physicality on this planet, we find that it is actually based on the plasmatic air. And the plasmatic air has a consistency of plasmatic nitrogen, plasmatic hydrogen, and plasmatic amino acid. And the net result is the combination of the 4: nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. And this is the basis of our amino acid construction. So the plasmatic component creates the physical component. And so from there, there is some kind of connection to our DNA. And we say the DNA kind of flows with the x-axis, which is the rotating field, which kind of relates to our atomic structure. When we look at the atoms and how they're created, we find that there are a lot of rotating fields, electrons rotating around the nucleus. And so that works in singularity. But what we find that with this information and how it's flowing, to grow the DNA, we have to be able to transcribe this information. And so we're going to discuss that in another class. But this transcription brings in a consciousness. And we know that there is an unconsciousness because we can maintain our physicality without maintaining our consciousness. And so what is it that maintains our physicality? And we find there's a tremendous connection to red meat. And this also was discussed on Thursday. And the thing about the red meat is that it is very much a part of the creation of the thionine, which is the initiating codon in the DNA sequence. So with an initiating codon, the rest of the codons are follower codons. And I hope to discuss that even more next week between initiating and following codons. But the thing is that there is a sequence. And we discuss how amino acids are formed and how DNA is formed through the foods that we eat. And we break foods down into basically essential and non-essential foods. But, you know, the thing is that all the foods are essential. It's just that essential foods need to be eaten, and non-essential foods are things that we produce internally. But is that correct? Because calcium is considered non-essential. And so this is the current knowledge in the knowledge of physical biology. And we're trying to discuss the plasmatic biology. And so the question had to be, is it evolution or is it adaptation? And it's looking very much like it's adaptation. And how do we adapt to that without the plasmatic presence? And so one of the things that gives us the plasmatic presence, of course, is the RNA, and the RNA and its interaction with the DNA, which is perpendicular. And so we find the RNA is on the y-axis, which is the polarity aspect of it. And again, if we relate this to the atomic structure, it gives us our duality, the duality between the electrons and the protons. And the combination of the two is our basic structure to give us our neutron. And there's a transcription of the RNA as well. And the RNA works very much with the unconsciousness. We refer to the RNA as a karma, as a carry forward. Now, if the DNA represents the growth, the life that we have, and the knowledge, and the DNA represents the consciousness, and the RNA represents the unconsciousness, and we know that the RNA and DNA interact. So the question becomes, if life is for learning, and if the purpose of our life on this planet is for the growth of our DNA, so that we can actually take advantage of the learning that we've gotten, does that mean because we cannot remember our past, that we cannot change our past? In other words, is it possible for the DNA to grow and for the RNA not to grow? So if the DNA is within our consciousness and the RNA is in our unconsciousness, and if the RNA is maternal and the DNA is paternal, will the RNA then take a break, basically, from the time prior to that we were born to the time after we die? And since energy is always in motion, and since life wants to live, and the whole process has to do with sentience, maybe we can understand better why the whole business of gene therapy, gene modification, or as I like to call it, gene mutilation, because what it does is it puts man ahead of God in terms of its capability of creation. And, you know, man was created in the image of the creator. And so as a creator created, we are capable of creating, but are we capable of having the same knowledge as the creator? I don't know. I don't know. But with respect to plasma science, we found that we can actually restore our original RNA DNA interaction. So this is an interesting concept because we find that the universal law supersedes man-made law. So I think the answer is man-made law cannot supersede universal law. That's the answer. And so for all the lion tamers in the audience, I know you like to use a whip and a chair to get things in order, but I wonder how we can get this omega-369 alpha linolenic acid to bend properly. How can we actually make it bend? How can we make it straighten it out? Who is giving the directions to this? How do you do this? When you understand how many alpha linolenic acids you have, so what we're saying is each one of these is a leg inside a phospholipid, and each phospholipid has two legs, and each one of these phospholipids makes a boundary around the cell, and we have trillions of cells in our body. How many lion tamers would it take to get these phospholipids to work properly? So there must be a power, there must be a communication that can allow the energy to flow from the inside of the cell to the outside. And there must be some kind of coordinated energy that can allow all the cells to, all the phospholipids to communicate together properly so that we can have an organized, non-chaotic way of conducting business. And so we see that there is a relationship between the outside, which is gravitational to magnetical, and there's an inside, gravitational to magnetical. And so we find that when we have two poles together, it creates a repulsion. And this is where we have the layer between the hydrophilic heads and the hydrophobic tails. And it is this layer which allows us to stand up. It allows oil and water to separate. And if that wasn't possible, then we'd all be mush. Now, another factor comes into play here, and that has to do with aerobics. What aerobics means is that oxygen is present. And it's interesting, when we reviewed the ganses, we find that oxygen is a main component of the CO2 gas, the zinc gas, and the copper gas. Okay, and we find that each of these ganses is actually combined of two separate elements. What is the difference between anaerobic? Well, oxygen is absent. One of the four popular gases that we like is the iron gas, which we call CH3. So there is no oxygen here. Let's just go back. There's no hydrogen here, but there is oxygen. There's no oxygen here, but there is hydrogen. And the hydrogen and the oxygen are two of the components of water. So when we digest food, what we're looking at from this food is actually the energy. And we get this energy from energy conversion. And isn't it interesting that what we're really doing is we're taking the glucose and converting it to fructose. And the process of doing that is called phosphorylation. And that is the subject of today's session. And that has to do with the Krebs cycle. This has to do with energy sequencing. If energy wasn't sequenced properly, then there would be chaos. And as we see from the plasma science, the universe is well organized. And we found that within the Krebs cycle, we have three energy states, which we call cytochrome A, cytochrome B, and cytochrome C. Very original names, but they are different energy levels. And within these levels, we have a product that is created. It's called adenosine triphosphate. So it involves the phosphate, and it involves three. So three phosphates hooked up to the adenosine. There is an adenosine diphosphate as well. But the adenosine triphosphate is actually the currency of life. And so biologically speaking, we say that there's 36 ATP produced from one glucose molecule. And this particular ratio reflects a healthy individual. And so in a healthy individual, we find that there actually is a production of 12 ATP on each of the three energy levels. And so before the second level is created, the first level needs to be completed. So we complete 12 on the A, plus 12 on the B, then plus 12 on the C. And then all three have to come together to create 36. And it's basically all or nothing. And when it's not all, then it's something else. And we call that an unhealthy situation. And the key breakdown is in the center cytochrome, the cytochrome B. There's a key breakdown here where we can only produce 2 ATP. And so that only gives us 26 ATP in this particular example. This number that I'm quoting is not a firm number, but it gives you a range, and it gives you a context to refer to. What we're saying, this is an unhealthy cell conditioning. Because we're demanding 36 ATP, we now have to supplement more glucose. And what is glucose? Well, glucose is a sugar. And so when we look at ATP and we say that it is the currency of life, we find that in the healthy cytochrome environment, it is aerobic. And in the unhealthy cytochrome B environment, it is anaerobic. And so the component that is producing the ATP is very much, in terms of efficacy, linked up to whether or not whether it's aerobic or anaerobic. This is a biological fact and has not been recognized by the medical community as being significant, but it is very significant. And what is even more significant, that now we can explain it. And this affects our transmutation, because when we have our amino acids as the basic building blocks of life, from there we create the DNA. And the DNA are the building blocks of the fatty acids, and from there we create the cells. And so when the DNA is in a healthy state, which is slightly alkaline, then we have proper cell communication. But when it becomes a little bit acidic, the DNA starts to elongate, and at that point we have a problem. And that is that we are not producing our proteins properly. We're not producing this reaction where we have the building blocks making a proper foundation. What is happening is that the cells are communicating through our DNA and our RNA, and the combination is transcription. And you know that when you get hurt or when you have a scratch on your skin or a cut, cells begin forming. These are called blastema cells. There's a signal that starts the cell production, but these cells are not differentiated until they become healthy, at which point the body, the cells communicate, the cell soul communicates to the position of where these cells are. And it starts to differentiate. So we're not going to grow our toes on our nose. And cell production, once it gets healed, stops. Unfortunately, in a cancer cell or in an unhealthy cell, cell production does not stop. And this is where we have the onset of cancer. So what we're looking at is to go from the inside to the outside, which we have a balance within, which is a Magrath condition, and we have a balance out, which is a Magrath condition. We have to be able to cross this gap. When we can't cross this gap because the phospholipids don't behave properly, because the fatty acids that constitute the legs of the phospholipids cannot open the gates properly, because the amino acids are not produced properly, we have a disruption in intracellular communication. Well, cells communicate with their neighbor. And if one can't communicate with itself, how can it communicate with its neighbor? And then if you have one in the community that is sick, isn't the whole community sick? And if that community is sick, and how does it communicate with the other community? And so we have intercellular disruption of communication. And what is this communication? Well, this is the plasma condition. This is the plasma communication. This is the substructure below the physical reality. This is what we've been talking about all along. We've been focusing on our small land matter state, which involves the basic transfer of energy, which we understand as heat and electricity. But as we go into the higher energy states and we understand about nuclear physics and plasma physics now, and how we go into the dynamic plasma states, we again see that to go from our physical GAN state to our non-physical plasma state, there's that fence again. And how do we get over this fence? And as we go up into the higher energies, we find that we need to have an impetus to jump the gap between energy level and energy level. And we find that as we go into the higher states, the energy needed to jump this gap is of a higher order of magnitude. And one of the key contributors to this energy, of course, is sugar. And so, do we need a sugar boost sometime? Well, if we review growth and what it means to have growth, when we look at concrete, which is your basic tetrahedral structure of SiO4, which is silicon with 4 oxygens, and the oxygen is obviously aerobic, and the oxygen comes from the presence of water. And so we find that the hydrogen shears off and forms is the currency, is the transactional cost of hydrating the concrete. And so we said the concrete grows. And so we had a chance to compare that to other forms of growth. For instance, the myelin sheath, how it grows around the nerve. The fatty acids, how they link up and link up all the carbons together, and how they have a direction. And we see the similarities between the monatomic structure of the nanostate versus the chain-like structure of the regular atomic state, which we see in the periodic table of elements. And so if we have a physical growth, we must have a soul growth. And so the soul growth, we say, involves the unconsciousness and the consciousness. Well, what does that mean? Well, we have to have an awareness before we can have an acceptance. You can't accept something that you're not aware of. And so before you have the acceptance, you have to have the learning. And you can't know something without the learning. But once you have the knowing, then the awakening and maturing can begin. But will the awakening and maturing happen? Well, that all depends on how we grow. And we all are capable of growing. So what does it mean to be able to grow? It means able to be a sentient being, where we have awareness, where we have sensitivity. And regardless of the fact whether it's carbon-based or silicon-based, all things, all manifestations have a soul. It's just how they interact and how much awareness that we have. And so this efficiency is what comes into question, and all has to do with relationships. And as we move through the various dimensions, the singularity, the duality, and the trinity, and these all give us a relationship, a field reference, a context. And we find that in order for us to look at these relationships of these, shall we say, trinities, then we are none of these three. Isn't that true? And that's the point. When we're looking at the relationships, basically, we're seeing a magnetical gravitational balance. Well, can we get this balance in the scientific community where we have the conservation of magnetical fields versus the conservation of energy? That is scientifically speaking. So what are we doing spiritually? And we look at the relationship between the spirit and the soul. And we find that the spirit is the motor of the soul. And the plasma science is adding these two sciences together and adding to the knowledge and making it more complete. And that is why I've been able to reintroduce today's class, where we're looking at the various dimensions, which we look in the old science as linear, the X and the Y and the Z axis. But we find that this is the older way to look at things. And of course, one of the things that DINO KRASPEDON, who was a brilliant Brazilian mathematician, was trying to articulate was the understanding of God as a set of understanding God as a set of mutually perpendicular lines of force oscillating upon themselves. But what he was really talking about was the X, Y, and Z axis and their relationship. But if we wanted to find out how energy would get from here to there, we find that it has an opportunity to go in each and every one of these dimensions. And how does it choose to do that? So in order to choose to do that, it has to choose a path. And in order to choose that path, it has to have a relationship to another path. So when we look at going from one corner to the other corner, we find that that path is not a straight line. It is kind of crooked. And so one path and involves the X, Y, and Z axis. But then we look at another path, and how do we choose that path? Well, we can't go through the first path, so we have an opportunity to pick this path. But why did we pick this path? Well, that is because we look at the relationship. We're only looking at two dimensions, right? We have to look at another dimension. And so we look at the Z-axis and we find a third dimension. And then we introduced the concept of pole flipping. And we found that we can flip the poles without having an ice age happen or a tsunami or some kind of catastrophe. So we see the product of three dimensions, the X, Y, and Z axis, and they have a different path and they have a different structure. And then we find that we can flip these. We flip the one, we flip the other, and we flip the other. And let's compare the two. And what we see is that it's like a lock in a door, and that you have a key, and you need to turn the key. And you can turn the key to lock and unlock. These are the sugar dimensions. This is how sugar operates. This is what's going on in the Krebs cycle. What causes the poles to flip? And so we find that there's something missing. There's a residue. We know that there's a mathematical residue. We discussed that in the neutron math. And we see that the plasmatic manifestation of this residue can be either face-centered or body-centered. And then we can reorientate this cube into a hexagonal format. And so that is dependent on our plasma repositioning with the plasma at the core and a repositioning to another plasma and another core. And we're repositioning all the time. And so we look at the basic plasma, which we cannot see with the naked eye. We see that the x-axis is rotation, the y-axis goes through the poles, and the z-axis indicates the field strength. But each one of these manifestations is individual, and each one of these manifestations has a component structure. Each one of these manifestations has a magnetic gravitational relationship and a substructure, and it's all well organized. And each one of them positions through the field strength. And this is where the plasma science is going, to understand the relationship of the various fields. And so when we find the fields have to come together and get attracted, and they have a rotation to maintain the energy, to attract more energy, to be able to do more and be more effectively. There's a substructure. There's a plasmatic substructure. And there is a backbone. And that's what was discussed on Thursday. Now we understand. I think now we understand at least how much we don't know. So, as we said, we are none of these dimensions. So maybe we're just a residue, but this residue is quite significant. And so we find that conventional science has discounted the plasmatic energy that is the substructure of the physical energy. And so maybe the residue that we are is just as significant. Well, of course it is, because you see, the manifestation of any reality is when two fields come together, two fields form another. And so the plasma feeding is what leads to the manifestation. But now we have a capacity that we can manifest either non-tangibly or tangibly, non-visibly or visibly, plasmatically or physically. And so therefore there is a plasmatic reality and there is a physical reality, but there is no rule that says that the physical reality has to be there, but the plasmatic reality has to be there. That is the rule. And so what kind of reality you have is the form artifact. And so that's what manifestation is. And so therefore, whether it's a plasmatic reality or a physical reality, it involves the emotion of presence. And so the emotion of presence is actually a form artifact of the energy in motion. And so now we understand that there's a whole lot going on in the background. And so how do we convey this to the thousands and millions of people around the world who are new to this technology, only insofar as the terminology, the dialogue, and the giving the time and attention to? The magnetical understanding of plasma science is the attraction and repulsion of magnetical fields. And so when we have a magnetical field, we invite a gravitational field. It is the balance of the magnetical gravitational fields that give a MAGRAV condition. And it is from there that we can do the giving and the taking. The question is always, who are we giving to, and who are we taking from, and what are we taking? And so that becomes the key point. What we now have to expand our understanding is that the MAGRAV condition is a balance of the attraction and the repulsion forces. And regardless of whether it's magnetical or gravitational, that is the net component of the MAGRAV condition. So in other words, to be magnetical, you have to have the energy attraction component plus additional magnetical energy coming and going. In other words, magnetical flow. Likewise, the gravitational flow also comes from the balance of the repulsion attraction field that creates a MAGRAV. That is the basis. The net gravitational field flow is the gravitational effect. So we have to take all of that into consideration when we make our energy determinations. So when we're looking at the basic cups of life, it's not just asking, well, what are these cups producing? There's a lot more to it. So what we're trying to do with these cups of life, of course, is when we look at the basic one cup, we see that it has a zinc plate and a copper coil, but the key component is the nano-coated copper coil in the center. And forgetting the wires, looking at the magnetical field and the gravitational field, now we have a construct. And what is going on inside, we know there's an interaction of these fields, but it isn't the product of these two. It's the energy that is being drawn in, because the GANs that's produced is of a higher energy state. And it is a higher energy state of many orders of magnitude higher than the nanostate. And it is a difference between the nanostate and the matter state, which is allowing a condition for this GANs to come in. And as this GANs, which happens to be a zinc GANs and a copper GANs in the cup one of life, then it creates a CO2 GANs. And all of these three GANSes are aerobic. And as a result, they can draw in the amino acid, which of course is a key component of the amino acid, is the oxygen context. Isn't it interesting that the water has the same oxygen content? All components that you're looking at here are aerobic contents. And so the second cup is kind of doing the same thing, except we've just replaced the zinc plate with a copper plate. And so it still has the magnetical field and it still has the gravitational field. And then we see that there's a relationship between the two cups. One is emotional and one is physical. There's a relationship, same type of interaction of fields. But, you know, one of the things is we like to do is keep the two batches apart. And this is becoming more and more important to understand. Are we trying to create a cup of man, or are we trying to create the cups of life? If we want to create the emotional GANs and the physical GANs, keep them apart, get the magnetical, the gravitational fields together and work that way. We still have this problem with the virus. And there were a lot of things that I wanted to discuss today about this, but let's just stay with the fundamentals. We want to eradicate the virus because the virus is an energy pack. And what is it doing? It's depleting us of energy. Well, let's deplete it of energy. And let's take some of that energy and convert it into food. Well, how do we do that? Didn't we just discuss the Krebs cycle? Yeah, we can do that. So we can also do that with the cups of man. Once we have our matter balance, once we have restored our health, then we have an environment on this planet that we have to deal with and contend with. And so the cups of man offer us this opportunity. And of course, working together, we're looking for the emotional and physical balance and create a magnetical field. And then we create a gravitational field, of course. And then, of course, we're looking for the position of our soul. And spiritually, we say, well, let's look for the stairway to heaven. We don't have to go up and down any stairs. Just look inside. That's where we are. That's where we're most stable. When we've looked at this GANs and the way it creates a rotating field, and we see that there's a hole in the GANs where there's nothing there. That is the creation of the soul right there. People will ask you, what is plasma? It's a kind of energy state. And it's very important, not only with respect to the pandemic, but we've come to the crossroads. We're going to be crossing the fence. Life has changed. Life has totally changed. And, you know, we're just part of the change, which is kind of a good thing, because we are the link. We are the link between the source and somewhere else. And the question always comes, You know, have we got this thing backwards or are we upside down? Well, the question is, are we only earthbound or are we also spacebound? And so now we have an opportunity to make a choice. The reason we have this opportunity is because we've broken through some of the scientific and spiritual limitations. Today, we've discussed some of the biological limitations. And this is an extension of the 376 Knowledge Seekers Workshop, which has taught us an unbelievable amount. And this has explained many of the biological processes that conventional science is able to explain. And so this is going to be the groundwork for new content that we will have on the Keshe Foundation TV, which we need to discuss for the science meets the soul and the soul of man for peace. Peace is what it's all about. And the reason for that is because the plasma will not work without the ethics of the universe. The morality, compassion, and courage is an integral part of the creation. The creation, the co-creation, and the procreation. It's an integral part. What we're looking for is the plasma satisfaction through the restoration of the emotional and physical vitality. This is the plasma bound science that is going to be delivered through the Universal Body Enhancement Spaceship units. This is giving us a new opportunity to understand that all things are working in combination, that when we look at the infinity loop, and what does it mean? That the magnetical has a relationship between the pushing and the pulling force. The gravitational has a relationship between the pulling and the pushing force. And the relationships of both have Magravity conditions. And don't forget the residue. We're the residue. That gives you something to think about. Basically, when we look at the star formation, that is a way for us to provide a pattern, open up to the universe, yield to the energy that is flowing to happen, and you will receive the benefits of it. You provide the pattern, you get the energy. That's the way it goes. And so, you know, we like to play games. We wanted to play this game of tic-tac-toe, and we asked, well, whose turn is it? And I keep never answering that question. You know, what they say is, well, who's doing the research? And when they answer, they say, we're paid to do the research. We're not paid to find the answer. Well, I'm paid to do the research, and I'm not paid to tell you what the answer is. How do you like me now? We are the messengers of peace and friendship. And we need to bring peace on this planet. That's what the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute, the plasma science is all about, delivering into the public domain via the World Peace Treaty, which we not only want to sign with our pen, but we need to sign with our heart and with our soul. The harmony and vitality of this planet and the harmony and vitality of our physical and emotional construct is very important. This is why new knowledge seekers become truth seekers. But will truth seekers become difference makers? I guess that's where the spirit comes in. And so the dynamic plasma state within is the universal language throughout. That's what we're trying to do, is deliver the plasma science in exchange for peace on Earth. Thank you again so much for listening. And Mark, back to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. This Krebs cycle, I've never heard of it before. Is he a scientist, or is this an acronym? The K stands for one thing and the R
This is a Canadian, no, that's a Canadian scientist, Canadian discovery. I think it was in the late 1980s that it was brought to the fore. And so it's been in the public domain for over 30 years. Hasn't made a difference, has it? We're still looking for a cure for cancer, the last I heard.
And are these hormones that you're talking about moving? between
Yes,
these
Mark.
legs and these heads?
Yes, Mark. Yes, yes, yes.
And I know Mr. Kesh said in the workshop, it wasn't as easy as just getting phosphorus or sulfur. There's way more involved in understanding how you use these to create this balance or to create what's missing. Is that what you're trying to get at here? There's a weakness.
A weakness.
That's an understatement. Okay.
Yeah, that's an understatement. So, you know, if we're looking at the hormonal science, there is a, shall we say, a scientific understanding of the hormonal science and how it applies to the Krebs cycle, and it is discussed in the well, it is discussed in the scientific community. So the scientific community definitely understands the creation of adenosine triphosphate, which is created in the mitochondria, which is in the cells. And so the mitochondria is the blast furnace of energy within our cells. And so the mitochondria is using the energy transfer from the glucose to the fructose. But this is done through the phosphorylation cycle. So
Is this man's knowledge or is this space knowledge?
this is man's knowledge. Mr. Kesh has provided the space knowledge. This is, you know, it's just unbelievable how, you know, this information dovetails together. But the thing is, this knowledge that I've given today is over 30 years old. It's ancient knowledge. It, you know, just the fact that it hasn't been utilized. It has been described. If you look at Wikipedia and you look at, you know, the creation of ATP and the energy transfer, there is a hidden system within the body called the electron transport system. And by definition, the electron transport system implies a physical type of system, but it isn't. It's an atomic electron transport system. It's Mr. Kesh who's been able to explain it. That's the difference. That's what's moved us ahead 30 years. It's frankly, it's as if nothing has changed in 30 years. Well, now lots has changed within the last couple of weeks. So we're just trying to put a little background context to it. That's all, Mark.
Okay. Is there anyone who would like to open this up more that maybe has a little bit more understanding of this than I do, to ask an intelligent question to Alex? I see Ed has his microphone open.
Hey, I don't think I have an intelligent question. It's kind of a question, but it's more I wanted to share something which I've been wanting to share for the last few weeks, but every time Alex teaches and he brings up the subject of the stronger feeding the weaker and the weaker needing to feed back and how does that happen, I think of this because it's something that impacted me several months ago when Mr. Kesh shared it, but I never had the diagram with me. And I now have this picture on my phone, and I wondered if I could share it and explain what I understand about it and see what Alex thinks about it.
And give us a little more background, Ed, if you could. Why is this, how is this dovetailing into Alex's teaching, or?
Well, I don't think it dovetails into his overall teaching today because I missed some of it. I tuned in late. I had to work today. But he's for the past several weeks, as part of his teachings, he's been sharing about the plasmatic principle: the stronger always feeds the weaker. But he said it's always a two-way street. and the weaker has to feed back to the stronger. And how does that happen? And he goes into a description of it, a lot of which I kind of don't understand, but I do understand the principle from a standpoint that Mr. Kesh shared, and I wanted to share this if I could.
Sure. It's no
I'm
problem.
trying to share my screen, but it's not working.
We see your screen. It says Ed. It's just the picture that you need.
Yeah. Okay.
First.
I have to allow Zoom to access my photos. That's the problem.
Okay, perhaps you want to change that setting and come back a bit, or
Yes.
you can do it on the right now.
Well, I'm trying to do it right now, but it's going to take me a minute here, I think.
I think Alex took the screen back, but when you're ready, you can just come right in.
Yeah, just let me know.
So you're saying, Alex, that if you can balance these conditions using this Krebs method or this Krebs understanding, it can also do something similar? Or are you just saying that it's more in the physicality state in man's knowledge rather than the plasmatic knowledge? Or is it both? Maybe that wasn't clear.
No, that is perfectly clear.
Like the corona, Mr. Kesh said, we're not the only ones that have a solution, and we're using a plasmatic solution. He said we're not to be so pompous that we would think our solution is the only solution to the situation. Is that what you're trying to get at?
Well, yeah, that's true. Is Ed sharing? Let me get back to the question. Is Ed sharing here?
Yes, I am, but I don't mean to interrupt what you're talking about now. I just wanted to, you don't need to address this right now. You can finish what you're saying and then I'll talk.
We can leave it on the screen for a minute. It looks like something we use. Go ahead, Alex.
Okay. So the thing is that 80% of the energy that we get automatically comes from the universe, because that's what maintains our Maglev condition. We have conditioned ourselves, however, which is why I brought up the situation between what we call evolution and adaptation. We have conditioned ourselves through adaptation to this environment and maintained our existence by eating. And we've used that as a major part of our energy creation. We have noticed over the years how our diet has changed, and it hasn't changed naturally. There's been a willful conspiracy. There's been a willful conspiracy behind this. There's been a willful conspiracy behind this in terms
to throw us off track in a way.
Yeah, but you know, the thing is that we need to have certain energies come into our body, and the so-called conspiracy has been removing these essential nutrients, and it has been affecting our health. And so the only reason these nutrients have become essential is because we have adapted to consuming them. And this is one of the things that happens with, well, let's say with drug addiction. We are adapted to taking those drugs. And so when those drugs come in, our body is conditioned to accept those drugs. And whatever those drugs are doing, our body, what it was providing for before, will stop providing because of the implementation of these drugs. So our bodies then become drug dependent. That's what it means to be addicted. And so one of the problems that we had, well, I say problems with the universal body enhancement unit, is that once the condition was resolved, then the need for the drugs was also resolved, but you cannot just stop the drugs cold turkey because of the time delay required by the body to adapt. And so this adaptation is fundamental in the Krebs cycle, because the adaptation is between the aerobic and the anaerobic cycles. And we find that the aerobic cycles are the ideal healthy condition. The anaerobic cycles, however, if they get into an extreme condition, well, they cause death. And precondition for that, a precondition in an anaerobic cycle, we call it diabetes or arthritis or obesity or sugar addiction. And sugar addiction is an important component because the sugar is actually part of the fructose, but in raw state. Before we can process the sugar, it has to be phosphorylated. And this is one of the problems that we have. We are having an overabundance of sugar in our diet. So we have adapted to a kind of diet that leads us into our condition where we have poor health and obesity. So diet is one of the ways that we can affect our health. But now we have another alternative, and that is through the plasma science. So until the plasma science came along, we had to describe how we got our health back through the relationship between aerobic and anaerobic condition, and to explain how that happened. That the explanation, however, has never been satisfactory. In other words, over 30 years ago, health situations in my family, so this is my own personal testimonial, we had cancer in our family, we got rid of it. So for the last 30 years, we haven't had to worry about cancer, but nothing's changed. We see that they're still looking for a cure for cancer. So I think that's the whole problem. It's not a matter of not being able to find the answer. It's like the man says, I'm paid to look, I'm not paid to find it.
It's been systematically excluded in so many ways. So we
Yeah,
couldn't
and
find it.
and that's unethical as far as I'm concerned.
And have you had medical classes or medical school, or did you just discover all this through a trial and error sort of process?
I have been taught. I spent a lot of time learning this, and I had some very, very good resources. So the resources that I've had have complemented the plasma science incredibly beautifully, and has allowed me to be a teacher in these classes and to give some context, but I have gotten to the point where my limitations have been exceeded. And so this is one of the problems that you have. As you gain more knowledge, you find out how little you know.
I know I had brought that up earlier, and I think Ed's ready to address the question here. But in that 376, Mr. Kesh said if the knowledge, and again, I'd have to listen to it again, was all the knowledges were as grains of sand on the beach, so to speak, man hasn't reached to be one grain yet. So our level of understanding and knowledge is quite low as compared to the universal knowledge, but we are heading in that direction. Ed,
Yeah,
are
but the
go ahead.
reason for that, Mark, the reason for that is because we're wasting a lot of time. All right,
We don't even realize it. We're just taking the knowledge that's given to us and trying to work with it from,
well,
let's say, the experts.
yeah, the experts. Yeah, well, the experts have had over 16 months to deal with the virus, and this isn't the first time. So I'm not going to make a commentary. This is not a forum for commentary.
Good. Ed, are you ready to proceed? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Alex, if you wanted to continue.
Please go ahead.
Yes, anytime that's appropriate.
Go right ahead, Ed.
So when Alex refers to the stronger always feeds the weaker, but it's always a two-way street. And so how does the energy come back from the weaker to the stronger? I always remember several months ago, it was in a knowledge seekers workshop, and don't ask me which one because I don't know right now. I'd have to look it up. But he drew this diagram and I took a screenshot of it, and I've had it ever since, because he also, it impacted me quite a bit. And he also, towards the end of his sharing, he talked about this being like the principle in all the universe of how things interact. And so I thought it was very significant. And so the diagram has a big circle and a small circle. And when he started to draw this, he drew first from the top of the big circle, going up and then coming down and then coming into the bottom of the small circle. And what he said is that, so this is the giving of the stronger to the weaker. But what happens is then when it comes in to the small circle, he colored in that small circle, and he did it a couple of different times. You'll see a couple of different colors there, the green and then the darker, whatever it is. But he scribbled in and he colored it in, because he says when the energy enters into the weaker, it goes in and it is transformed by however the weaker is receiving it and using it. And then so it becomes a different energy, and that energy is what is shared back. It comes out the top of the small and goes back into the bottom of the big circle. It's not the same energy that was given, it's a transformed energy. And it's the energy that is needed by the bigger circle. And the key was the transformational process that happens in the receiving of the weaker, how it receives and what happens inside, and it transforms that energy and then gives it back. And that is what the larger one needs. I mean, this just made so much sense to me. I understand this mostly from a relationship standpoint, because I have experienced this most dynamically, I think, just in relationships in my life, friendships and others, even just acquaintances when we've met. But when I felt an attraction and I have I've shared something with somebody, and when there is a reception on the other part, it is like a dynamic happening, because they're being blessed by what I'm saying, but at the same time, they're responding back because they're understanding what I said, and then they're giving back. And the two of us just have a wonderful time sharing back and forth. And it happens in romantic relationships as well, and friendships and stuff. But then, so going back to this diagram, the two arrows in between the two signifies, I believe, if I remember correctly, this is the balance distance between the two, the gravitational and magnetical balancing between the two, and it's all dependent on the sharing between the two and what is done with the energy that is received and given back. So I don't know, did that make sense to anybody else? Because this has made a huge impact on me as far as the principle of the stronger feeds the weaker, but the weaker gives back the transformed energy, and that relationship determines the distance or the interaction between the two. That's
Well, isn't the stronger elevating the weaker to get some of its energy so that they can both be the same size circle? And then you've created that balanced condition?
I think in a way that's happening, but I'm not sure it happens all at once. I think it happens as the weaker absorbs what the stronger is giving, but it has to utilize that energy to grow at the internal level. I guess I'd call it at the soul level, but there may be other levels involved as well. So yes, I think that's happening. And then at that point, I'm not sure what would happen to the relationship when they're equal. Maybe then they both go their own ways. I don't know. But as far as the two-way sharing of energies from the stronger to the weaker does give back, but it gives back a transformed energy that is needed by the stronger. So that's the way I was seeing it and understanding it. Is that comprehensible to anybody else?
Well, we have the artist here who uses this drawing quite frequently, if you'd like to comment, or Alex, if you'd like to make a comment. It's not only, I think, elevating its position to be equal to the stronger, but it's also confirming the stronger's existence.
Yes, that too.
I have a comment about what you just said, Ed. First of all, your comment is excellent. The part that I'm not happy about is your uncertainty. And the fact of the matter is that I personally think that you're very accurate. And to get that accuracy, there has to be a certainty. So I'm not really certain where this uncertainty comes from. And I would wish that you would be a little bit more confident in your presentation, because you're talking about synergy, and what you see is that each individual here is creating an energy focus point, and the combination of the two creates an energy exchange. And it is this energy exchange which is the synergy aspect of it. So the energy exchange is not just between these two, it is between these two to maintain this balance. And this balance is fairly important to maintain that relationship. But collectively, this relationship is related to other relationships. And this is where the plasma positioning takes shape. So collectively, as human beings, we are not thinking in schemes large enough. You know, first of all, just to have the basic understanding of the fundamental plasma energy circle, and then to have the understanding of the interaction with other plasma energies, and then to take that and connect to other plasma energies. You have to be able to understand and accept that if you take this particular diagram with these two particular Magravs conditions and extrapolate that to the over 70 trillion cells in your body who are doing exactly the same thing, and you start to look at the absolute beauty of the creation of the universe to be able to do that. So, you know, this is a monumental task when you think about it. Over 70 trillion cells in our body, and we only have 7 billion bodies on this planet. So, you know, we still have many orders of magnitude to go in that regard. But this is what the growth entails. And I want to thank you very much. That is a terrific presentation, and you're, as far as I'm concerned, it's excellent. Thank you.
And it's probably a little foreign to our understanding. I know there's a saying in Italian, the big fish eats the little fish. So this is the way we've been brought up, and we understand that the stronger always dominates the weaker. But in space, it's just the opposite. The stronger feeds the weaker. So maybe that's where a little bit of that uncertainty has come from. All the souls that are within us always have understood the stronger eats the weaker. But it's not correct. That's man's knowledge, not the space knowledge.